for joining today. Exciting day coming tomorrow, so I wanted to take a few minutes and discuss a potential outcome for the election. And, the thing with American elections and the American political system in general. There's a lot of things written down in the Constitution that dictates how things will run, but those weren't always spelled out. Some of those instructions were vague, especially in the way they assigned responsibility to some things. Leaves a lot of things up to be challenged and to be questioned. And that's really what we're going to focus on today, is in watching the results come in tomorrow night, we're really only watching the first step in a very long process. So I'm just going to go through a few slides that I put together. I am recording this session for the folks that have mentioned that they wanted to come and that can't, so you can catch up on this later. But we will go through and talk about this, and then I'll leave some time for questions at the end, because you may have some, and I'm happy to talk about them. It's an exciting time of year. This doesn't happen every day, although it feels like it does, because election campaigns are frankly seemingly endless now. But the inspiration for this talk comes from a few books that have been written over the past several years that talk about how American elections are shifting. They're not so much being fought about voting and getting votes, but the process of voting. There's a lot of litigation that is happening, and lawsuits and legal challenges and changing the rules around elections. Those are the real battles at election time. And Edward Foley in Ballot Battles documented a lot of this in his book, that in my lifetime, the past 40 years or so, there's been relative calm at election time. But outside that, elections have been very bitterly contested, and there has been physical violence, assassination attempts, and of course the Civil War, all over election results. And we've kind of, when we watch American elections, we just think of them as a routine event, but they're anything but. And so there's been a lot of writing about this. Ned Foley has also written several law review articles over the past few years that outline the things that could happen. And that's really the inspiration for this talk, is to talk about some of the legal aspects of voting and the legal challenges. There's two aspects to any election. There's the casting of votes and the counting of votes. And, in this election, it looks like one party is trying to win the casting and the other party is focusing on the counting. And it's, we've got it from the chief himself has noted that this is very much the strategy. A couple days ago at a press availability, he said it would be nice if there was a winner on November 3rd, because I don't think we should be counting ballots for 2 weeks. Last night, so we are doing this on November 2nd, last night before going on stage at a rally in North Carolina, he said something similar, that on election night we're going in with lawyers in Pennsylvania and Nevada. So clear strategy, not worried about the casting of votes. He's going to focus on the counting of votes. And there is plenty of room to challenge that, because the way we think the Electoral College works isn't really how it works in practice. We assume that Americans show up on election day and they vote for president. Now, for those of you in my Canadian and American politics classes, we know that doesn't really happen, at least not in a direct sense. Rather, there's a mediating institution called the Electoral College. So citizens aren't directly expressing their preference to elect the president, but rather they're mediating it through this Electoral College system that awards points. And the winner is the one that gets the most points. We've talked about this, that each state is worth a different amount of points, Electoral College votes, and you need 270 to win. So Texas, 38 points. Florida, 29 points. You want to win as many as you can to get up to 270. There's a rationale behind this. It doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense to us, but it made sense 230 years ago when they came up with the idea. One of the byproducts is that candidates focus on swing states. The campaigning typically only happens in about 6 different places, and this year is no exception. Over the final days, we're seeing both candidates go to Florida, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Ohio, Nevada, and a little bit in Texas. So that's pretty much it. Some stops in Michigan too. So a lot of the country gets left out of this process because the swing states that are a little more balanced between Republicans and Democrats carry a lot of the weight. So that's what we think happens. People show up, they vote, add up the points, they declare a winner. But that's not really how it works. November 3rd is the start of the process. It is voting day, and I've called it on this slide, general election day, where voting ends, because voting's been happening for weeks already. Some states allow early voting, just like we do in Canada here. We have early voting periods, advanced voting. And in many cases, they can't start counting those votes until election day. And right now, about 93 million people have voted already in the election, so that's a lot. So November 3rd is the last day to physically be able to cast your vote. Then they start counting. Some states are allowed to count early in the day. Some states have to wait till the polls close. It's different in every state. But they start counting on November 3rd. By December 8th, the states have to finish counting. So right away, we've got almost a month for states to finish counting and to make that count official. Then a week after that, the Electoral College meets. Now, the Electoral College isn't just a point system. It used to be an actual gathering of people. And they would meet to certify their votes and determine who gets Florida's 29 votes, which candidate gets Pennsylvania's 20 votes. Then they physically send those to Congress, where they will be counted on January 6th. Why such a big gap between December 14th and January 6th? There was a time these votes physically had to be sent by, horseback, essentially. So there was a bit of a time lag. But that's how the process works. They get cast, they get counted, the Electoral College meets to certify the votes, then they send them to Congress. Congress convenes and counts them, and then the new president is sworn in on January 20th. So technically speaking, there is never a winner on November 3rd. There's an idea of who's going to win, but that winner isn't certified till December, and the new president doesn't come into office until January 20th. So there's a whole lot of room for things to happen, and especially legal challenges. Here's, again, sort of graphically how that works, because there's some spots in this process that could be open to challenge from one candidate or another. On November 3rd, voters show up in their respective states and cast their votes. Then after that, December 14th, the Electoral College meets. So people gather in the states. So the electors of the state. So Florida, they'll gather in the state capital. Pennsylvania, they'll gather in Harrisburg. In Ohio, they'll gather in their capital as well. They get together, they tally up the votes and certify who is going to get our state's 18 electoral votes, or 29 electoral votes, or 20 electoral votes. They count them, certify them, the governor certifies them, and sends them to Congress to be counted. So that's how the process works so far. Then Congress convenes on January 6th. So this is the Electoral College meeting to count the votes, or count the Electoral College votes, rather, that are sent from the states. And a joint session of Congress, so the House of Representatives and the Senate, convene in the same chamber. This is the new Congress, so the one that will be elected in November and take office on January 1st. So this is the new Congress that presides over the vote counting, and the vice president is the one that's in charge of this. If you grew up in a country that isn't the United States, you think that's strange that a vice president gets to preside over the counting of the votes in their own election, but that's just the way it happens. Then they open the envelopes and they sort of award the votes. Okay, 55 votes from California, you go to the Democrats. 38 votes from Texas, you go to the Republicans. And they keep doing that until one candidate has 270. So it's pretty straightforward. It's boring. It's not usually televised. It's not usually that exciting. But what happens if a state, and I'm using Pennsylvania as an example, what happens if Pennsylvania sends two envelopes? One that has 20 votes for President Trump. The other has 20 votes for Vice President Biden. What happens then? Which one of those gets counted? Not sure. This has happened before in the election of 1876, where several states each sent two packages, a Republican one and a Democratic one. And it was up to Congress to figure out, well, which one is the real one? And, well, it's hard to say. How could this even happen is probably a question you're asking. And I'll give you some background on how this could happen. When states are counting the votes, there is sometimes a shift in terms of the lead. The lead might change hands as the votes are counted. Some states, experience a blue shift, where when you count the votes first, it looks like the Republicans are winning. But when you count all the mail ballots that tend to be used more heavily by Democratic voters in Pennsylvania, then the results shift towards the Democrats. They call that a blue shift. So the longer you're counting votes, it appears that the results are shifting away from the Republicans into the Democrats. Call that a blue shift. Some states have the opposite. Florida is an example where the early votes get counted first, which tend to be heavily Democratic. So they'll get counted first, and it looks like the Democrats are winning, but then more and more Republicans tend to vote on election day and after, and so then their votes shift the results towards the red side or to the Republicans. So those counting shifts can give the illusion that something funny is happening as these votes are counted, because they're a lot different than the initial results that are reported during the primetime broadcasts. So if, for example, Pennsylvania is counting votes, it's possible that they could experience a significant blue shift. This election, you can just see from the numbers there, registered Democrats requested a lot more mail ballots than registered Republicans. So that could mean that if a lot more Republicans are voting on election day and a lot more Democratic ballots are coming in the mail, that could mean there would be a blue shift. The longer the counting goes on, you'll see the Democratic votes get added, and it'll appear like they're sort of taking the lead away from the Republicans, which is, that's what happens when you count the votes. It's happened in 2018. The Democrats shifted, but there was a 22,000 vote swing from when the polls closed to to later when they finally finished counting the votes for governor. So it's possible that there could be a blue shift in Pennsylvania. Looks like Republicans are winning when the results are coming in on election night, but then after the election, the Democrats could do better. So, hypothetically, we could have a very vocal member of the executive branch, the president, who likes to take his views to Twitter. He might notice and feel like he's winning on election night, claim victory, and say, "Stop counting, that's it, I won." However, if votes were continuing to be counted, then they might give a very different winner. But if the president says something, the networks cover it, it might appear like he's claiming victory. So let's say he says, "I'm winning, stop counting." Well, what happens? When the Electoral College meets on December 14th, there is, they would convene in their state capital, and in Pennsylvania, that happens to be a divided government with a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor. And so, while the Democratic governor would probably certify those results, saying, "Yep, this is it, we counted the votes, we have the winner," the Republican-controlled legislature might say, "No, we don't think that's true. We think these votes were fake. Our president says they're fake. Therefore, we will pass our own version. We will certify our own election and give those 20 electoral votes to President Trump." So now there are two competing slots of electors, they call them. There are packages of electoral votes that will be sent to Congress. Now what happens? Could this happen? Yes, this has happened before in 1876 and again sort of in 1960. When we're counting the votes on January 6th, how do we do it? How do the legislators reconcile the fact that there are two envelopes for Pennsylvania, one claiming to be 20 votes for the Democratic candidate, one claiming to be 20 votes for the Republican candidate? Well, if the two chambers can't agree, the vice president would have to find a way to decide on the issue, or they might just throw them all out altogether. It's unclear. There isn't a lot of historical precedent here in terms of what should happen and what the vice president would do. But here's why this is possible. In the Constitution, the authority of elections is given to the states, conducting elections in such a manner as the legislature thereof shall direct. The legislature. It says the legislature. Why? Well, because legislatures make laws about elections. They determine who's eligible to vote and how the elections will happen. However, they don't run the elections. The executive branch runs the elections. Governors, secretaries of state, they are the ones that actually carry out the administration of the election. Some states have made changes to their administration. They've extended the deadlines for mail ballots. They've allowed people the option to vote by mail, whereas in other elections they may not have, again because of sort of COVID-related health concerns. So right away, we're starting to see there's a discrepancy between what the legislature might want and what the executive might want, the people that run the elections versus the people that pass the laws about them. Now, the Trump campaign itself has already sued 7 states over mail-in balloting. In total, just other litigation with other parties, there's been almost 400 lawsuits brought in 44 states challenging different aspects of the voting process. So, for example, in some places, the governor might have extended a deadline, and then the legislature will have sued them to say, no, you can't do that. So there's a lot of that going on. And this potential for conflict is possible where there is a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature, which we have in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so right away we can see there's the possibility of conflict between those two over election rules. And I mean, in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, this has happened where the legislature has sued the governor to try and fight over things like mail-in ballots and deadlines in which votes get counted and when to start counting votes. All those things have been subject to litigation. So that's why I think this prospect exists, is because of that, sort of those 4 states, which are all swing states. These are all important states that will be vitally important for each candidate to win, yet there's divided government in each one. So if there's delays in counting the votes, it's conceivable that the president would say, hey, I don't believe this is valid, and direct the state legislature to act and to certify the results for him. Now, this has been reported by the Atlantic that he's actually tried to sort of reach out and explore this possibility. And then the president himself last night, I don't know if anybody's kind of has been paying attention to the press coverage, but before he took the stage at a rally last night, he even said on election night, before the night is over, we're sending in the lawyers to Pennsylvania and Nevada to stop the counting. So this is, I mean, kind of saying the quiet part out loud a bit, but that's the intention. You know, elections are about casting votes and counting votes. We've got, the one party is probably going to win the casting, and then the president is trying to win the counting. It has happened before, 1876. It was a very protracted and bitter contest about counting votes, where several states submitted 2 slots of electors. There's a lot of voter suppression. This is coming in the wake of Reconstruction after the Civil War. 1960, Hawaii had just become a state. They had sort of just conducted an election, and they somehow had sent 2 packages of electors, and Vice President Nixon sort of chose which one, and he he erred on the side of the other party. He was running in the election, but he lost the election, as it turns out. And then it almost happened in 2000 election. There wasn't a winner for several weeks afterwards, and the Supreme Court eventually stopped the recount. But if they didn't, the Florida legislature was going to do that. They were going to certify their own vote count if the governor didn't do it. So it could happen, but it depends. This would only happen if the election was actually close, and it did come down to mail-in ballots in one key state. So it may or may not happen, but I just wanted to raise this issue because it could be something that seemingly happens out of nowhere, and frankly, it isn't out of nowhere. This is something that's been discussed for the past several years as a potential outcome. So be mindful of that. And also, the final takeaway is the process. November 3rd is really the first part in a long process of counting votes and certifying them, and then convening, and then sending those to Congress, and so on. So this is a long process. Do we ever really know the winner on election day? In practical terms, yeah, we might, but in legal terms, no. In legal terms, the new president is not the new president until they're certified and they take office on January 20th. So I will leave it there. That's all I wanted to get through in terms of my own presentation, but I'm going to take a sip of my coffee here and open up the floor to questions, if anybody has any.